We had a variety of options to consider for our next stop: Cork, Kilmore Quay or Arklow on the Irish coast, or Milford Haven in Wales. However, I then found a fault in the Navionics gold chip in the plotter. There was no detail at all on the Irish coast from Cork right round to just south of Dunleary. I had a paper chart of the area, but it was old, and there had been a lot of changes in the voyage on the southeast corner of Ireland. The idea of making landfall in the dark with no plotter and an out-of-date paper chart was not appealing, so Milford Haven looked the favourite, subject to weather. May the 13th dawned bright and clear again. The forecast for Lundy was southwest 2 to 3, increasing 4 to 5, perhaps 6 in the west later. The harbour master called by and asked if we wanted any fuel. He said we'd be needing it if we were leaving today. We declined, but emptied a jerry can into the main tank and topped it up by taking the dinghy to the beach and walking across the isthmus to a garage on the Porth Cressa side. We slipped at 10:40 and motored slowly around the coast to watch the scenery go by, then headed due north. The islands slowly faded into the distance and disappeared at about 3 o'clock. Shortly afterwards, a light breeze got up, allowing us to sail. The Navionics chip in the plotter dated to 2008, and I had intended to replace it, but Navionics had doubled the cost of replacement that spring, so I decided the old one would do. After all, rocks don't move that much. One thing that had changed, though, was the TSS east of the Scillies, which had extended northwards, but as it ran due north-south, it was easy enough to stay to the west of it. Not that it mattered, we didn't see a single ship all day. Around 8 o'clock we saw a line of cloud approaching on the western horizon. Before it got to us, we put in the first reef as precaution and continued north on a deep broad reach. Even though the wind picked up to 20 knots, the autohelm was coping well, so I turned the response rate down to save on battery power. About 10:30, Matthew went below to heat up a chilli before it got dark. At 11 he stuck his head up to say it was ready, and at that point I made 2 bad mistakes. The time had come to jibe onto starboard if we were to have a comfortable angle of sailing into Milford. Harriet would have done no harm to eat first and jibe 10 minutes later. I handled the jibe on deck while Matthew stayed below to keep the food under control. The jibe itself went fine, and I pushed the button to re-engage the autopilot, forgetting that the response rate was turned down. The poor thing couldn't adapt fast enough to the changed wave pattern and promptly took us into an involuntary jibe. On deck that was not a problem. I jibed us back immediately and steered manually. But during the involuntary jibe, the rear cabin door had swung to, crushing Matthew's thumb as he tried to brace himself. He lost control of the chilli, which went all over the floor, and as I jibed back he again slipped on the chilli and banged his head. He appeared at the hatch looking pale and said he had to go and lie down. I carried on steering manually until 1:45, when Matthew reappeared and said he needed to do something to take his mind off the pain in his thumb. I went below to write up the log. At that point we had 38 miles to go to the entrance to Milford Haven, and the wind was 26 knots from the southwest. I spent the next half hour on my hands and knees lifting floorboards and cleaning up chilli which had got everywhere. While I was doing that I occasionally noticed the odd lurch, but nothing untoward. However, when I finally got up and went to the chart table, I was horrified. Wind speed was reading 40 knots and the log was reading 15. It was only then I became aware of the shrieking in the rigging. I stuck my head out of the hatch and was further horrified. It was pitch black looking forward. Vision stopped at the mast. I could not even see the bows. The cockpit was quite well illuminated because the bow wave, which started at the mast, was throwing up sheets of phosphorescent white water that spread out into a flat sheet of white behind us. Matthew asked if I would clip him on, as he rather had his hands full. As I crawled back from doing that, we rose to a bigger wave than usual and roared off. The binnacle log was right by my face, and shot up to 17 knots. We were severely over-canvassed and urgently needed the third reef. However, the time for doing that easily had been and gone. We would know how to round up into big seas and what had become a fairly steady 44 knots. The chance of severe sail damage to the laminate sails in the ensuing flogging was almost a certainty. Running as we were, the high speed kept the apparent wind down to below 30 knots most of the time. The problem came as we slowed as a wave came up behind us and we rose into the full force of the wind. If that coincided with a gust, she would round up a little with some flogging of the main before the janeur filled, pull the head round, and we tore off like an express train. The real danger lay in bringing the bows back too quickly and going into an inadvertent jibe. I went below to put a harness on and turn the radar on. I was unsure if visibility was zero or it was just very black. I didn't fancy running into the side of a tanker we hadn't seen at 20 miles an hour. There was nothing on AIS, but there was a radar return on the port bow, about 5 miles away. I put the EBL on that and was heading back on deck when an alarm I'd never heard before sounded. Scanned all the instruments, could not see anything out of the ordinary. After what seemed an age, it occurred to me it might be the new battery monitor signalling low voltage. We started the engine in neutral and the alarm went off. Then the Milford Haven Coast Guard came on with the weather forecast. It was just the same as it had been all afternoon, no more than force 6. I felt like calling him up and telling him to stick his head out of the window. The lights of the radar contact then became visible. Marper was useless, but it was clearly either stationary or moving very slowly towards us. No yacht would have been making to windward in this weather, so I assumed it was a fishing boat either hove to or still trawling. By this time the wind seemed to have eased a little. Okay, only to 40 knots. But the rounding up had become less, and we were heading to a safe all-weather harbour, where it sounded as though the wind was moderating inshore. I decided to leave the sails alone. Gradually the wind moderated to the mid-30 knots. The surfing became less extreme, and by 4:30 we were abeam St Anne's Head, with the wind down to the force 6 the Coast Guard had been talking about. Going down the Haven, the wind eased so much that we ended up by motoring for the last few miles, before berthing at Nayland Marina at 6:30. We had logged 144 miles since leaving the Scillies. Our average speed from leaving St Mary's to arriving at Nayland was only 7.5 knots, but the average for those last 38 miles to St Anne's Head was 10 knots. Given that we were probably only averaging hull speed for the first and last hour of that period, we probably averaged about 11.5 knots over the middle 2 hours. We crashed out until late morning, and I awoke to find Matthew dressed and setting off to find a doctor to relieve the pain in his thumb. I reassured him I'd done this sort of thing several times before. I dug out the paper clip we had used to clear the outboard telltales in the Scillies and lit the oven. The paper clip, heated cherry red, applied very gently to the nail above the retained blood, burns through easily. There's a spurt of blood relieving the pressure, and the pain subsides almost immediately.
I like the backdrop from the radio.